I was getting ready for work, and then I heard the first gunshot. I just knew that someone had got shot on the street, and it was by police. It was such a surreal moment. I was kind of just like tweeting really fast. I remember I had a lot of typos. And then people started saying it.
It was only a few weeks after Eric Garner when it happened. And so there was something about August 9th in Ferguson that really became a catalyst for the eruption of a national movement.
People wanted not just answers, they wanted justice.
We were treated like we were in a war.
If you are in the middle of the street, you're unlawfully assembled and disperse immediately.
Everything erupted in Ferguson. This is rage, it's profound sadness, and it was all on Twitter.
Social media extended the reach of the activists. It both allowed people in faraway localities to have a minute-by-minute view of what was continuing to happen in Ferguson, and it also meant that activists could communicate immediately about where demonstrations were, where protests were. It just accelerated the rate of activism surrounding this case.
We were out in the streets responding to the needs as they were presented. And in that moment, young people were saying, we're gonna stand up and we're not going home.
I was just there. I wasn't there trying to be the news or be a reporter. I just tweeted everything that I knew to be true. And the next thing you know, like the police are shooting tear gas. And it was the first time I thought I was gonna die.
Oh, they're coming back. Go, 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 go,
Ferguson, Missouri is under a state of emergency.
I signed an order declaring a state of emergency.
This is for your safety.
The eyes of the world are watching.
Ferguson becomes a magnet for activists around the country. The activists who form Black Lives Matter organize a freedom ride to Ferguson where they bring 500 activists from around the country to demonstrate solidarity.
I was sitting on my couch, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I saw the events unfolding on Twitter. And I said, I just want to go. I want to at least bear witness. So I got in the car, drove 9 hours, ended up in St. Louis. The second night that I was in St. Louis was the first night of the curfew. And it was the first night that I got tear gassed. And it was in that moment that I became a protester.
People from the Arab Spring were tweeting to the protesters in Ferguson how to deal with the tear gas. They were coaching them from Arab Springs to Ferguson, making that connection organically. But I thought, oh snap, this is different. This is different. They're in solidarity, uprising.
It became clear and undeniable that this was more than a few angry people on the street. Without every single person who was out there tweeting and Facebooking and posting pictures and standing in front of those officers in Ferguson, there would be no movement.
Eric Gardner was in New York, Trayvon Martin was in Florida. People think these things don't happen in the Midwest. But now this is, in a sense, the epicenter of a national movement.
I bring to you one of the most influential civil rights leaders of our history, Reverend Al Sharpton. America, it's time to deal with policing. We are not the haters, we're the healers. But then let me say this, what does God require? That Michael Brown does not want to be remembered for a riot.
Not at all. Not at all.
Sitting around having ghetto pity parties rather than organizing and strategizing. You've lost where you come from.
You know, there's this idea that this was a space created by these young people, that they'd been in the streets, they'd been tear gassed, they had been leading the chants and crafting the signs, and they didn't want older civil rights activists taking what they had created. And I think that exposed and was one of the first kind of fault lines in what has been a deep ideological split between older Black America and younger Black America.
It was almost like a bat signal had gone off and civil rights had been flashed in the sky, and all of a sudden they rushed like Cape Crusaders to come in and save the day. But this was a very modern movement. People weren't expecting civil rights leaders of a bygone era to stand side by side to these young people who had a voice.
Hey, you marching today with us, or you just gonna sit in the car?
Because we haven't seen you marching at all, Jesse. We ain't seen you.
I remember Jesse Jackson showed up, and he got yelled down by some of the young activists. This was about defiance. That is the movement.
These protesters took control of the narrative and took it out of the hands of the old guard civil rights establishment. And this was really the first time where people said, no, we're not going to defer to you. We have been successful thus far. So the people of Ferguson are not going away until Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot Mike Brown, is indicted.
The duty of the grand jury is to separate fact from fiction. They discussed and debated the evidence among themselves before arriving at their collective decision. After their exhaustive review of the evidence, the grand jury deliberated over 2 days, making their final decision. They determined that no probable cause exists to file any charge against Officer Wilson and returned a no true bill on each of the 5 indictments.
We see just the enormity of the problem that the movement is up against, because for every incident of police brutality that has been exposed, we still have the fact that Darren Wilson, who killed Mike Brown, was not indicted. Every time people have thought the movement disappeared, it reemerges on the streets. It erupted in an entirely new way in the city of Baltimore in April of 2015. So how do you actually go about fighting for justice?
You would think if you have an organized group in America saying we want dead cops, that all decent people would reject that group. You would think, correct?
You know, you're tweeting out that you got
No one prepares you for backlash. Fox News and Bill O'Reilly in particular have come after us. But where did that narrative come from? That's not coming from our mouths. That's not the shared story we have.
You were able to find one clip of some people who were saying some outrageous things, but that is not a reflection of the entire movement. Has anybody in the leadership ever said that? Has DeRay McCutcheon ever said that? Has anyone in the leadership ever said that?
Let's talk about the backlash against Black Lives Matter in some corners of the press. Is it warranted, or is a dangerous connection being made between the movement and a misunderstood message?
Every struggle I've ever been a part of, there are always outliers. There are always occasional folk who show up who often co-opt or twist the message.
So do you feel that those Fox News hosts were seizing on these comments in order to paint with too broad a brush? What do you think happened this week? It seemed like Fox had a narrative very clearly.
The unfortunate thing is this is the Black Lives Matter movement, which can only be described as nonsense, is creating a lot of this type of thing around the country, and it's going to backfire, quite honestly.
They will do everything they can to make sure that they are top of show hitting you with hard headlines. But we have to anticipate it. We have to stop being surprised because this is real.
Today, the Harris County Sheriff's Office mourns the loss of one of our own. Deputy Darren Goforth was senselessly struck down while pumping gas at a Chevron station in northwest Harris County yesterday evening. We've heard Black Lives Matter. Well, cops' lives matter too. So why don't we just drop the qualifier and just say lives matter and take that to the bank?
I think what's really important is getting the narrative right. And the narrative from the movement has always been, we are not a movement about harming police. We are a movement about holding police accountable.
What do we do when people act outside of the expectations of who we want to be together? What does it mean for us to be a group? I think in the pursuit of visibility, we can forget what we're fighting for. The glorious and glamorous part is people in the streets and, you know, protesting and all of that. What's not glamorous is figuring out, okay, how do we be together over the long term? How do we learn how to organize?
One of the major difficulties for a truly leaderless movement is this is very much a mosaic of activism. It's bigger, much bigger than any given, quote unquote leader, any given quote unquote organization. And this is the real problem, right?
This is a movement, this is ongoing. We're late, frankly. No matter what we do, we're late. So what's next? Get it together, get informed, become a team.
We all talk about how social media transformed this movement. But now we've seen young protesters without organized leadership. And so there is a question about where the movement goes from here.
The Black Lives Matter movement in my generation, we have to evolve. We have to make sure it doesn't stop, like how other movements did.
2 years ago, hundreds of protesters gathered in Lower Manhattan to occupy Wall Street. But the Occupy movement had its fair share of problems. From protesters' resistance to clear leadership, the movement seems to have faded away.
We come from a long legacy of protest and struggle. But now we have to galvanize, thousands and thousands of people to fight for reforms in their country and in their government. And so that's why we started Black Lives Matter as a network of 39 chapters around the world.
We gon' be all right. We gon' be all right.
And so the movement is growing.
We gon' be all right. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be all right.
Now, Black Lives Matter is a national organization. Supporters disrupt rallies for Democrats and Republicans alike. The tactic has had an impact. The day after activists interrupted Bernie Sanders, he posted a racial justice platform on his website.
We're now talking about what does it mean to be a movement full of people who are leading and doing the work in different ways, and that there is no one way to organize, there's no one way to be in this work. What people do here is they repeat the problem. And you're like, I get the problem. We know the problem. I don't need another summit about it. Which is why I'm always focused on the concrete stuff.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah. So I asked Netta and Brittany and some other people if they wanted to partner, and we created Campaign Zero. Mapping police violence was a statement about here are the facts. It is a powerful tool, and we continue to use it to inform our work. When I think about running for mayor, it's about being in a place to change people's lives today and tomorrow. It's about real, concrete things that can happen at the policy level to structurally end police violence.
And that's what's different about this movement. We are seeing leaders come forward. And this is because they took social media and made it work for them. Black Twitter is the matrix. Black Twitter popped it off. And because of Twitter, we know who Patrice is, we know who Alicia is, we know who Netta is. This generation is not gonna let them be nameless. And they're doing that.
So for a movement that's not formally funded, that doesn't have a big headquarters in Washington, D.C. or a registered lobbyist, it's a lot of momentum. So where does Black Lives Matter go from here? Well, joining us tonight is Alicia Garza. Thank you for joining us tonight.
You had people who had come from regular backgrounds, who were teachers and students, now became these big personalities. They were on the covers of magazines. They were being interviewed by the New York Times. And in doing so, they were leading a whole generation of Black people, and they were representing them as well.
We can actually change the world if we implement changes on the inside. But also, people need to press from the outside. That pressing from the outside forces things that will otherwise not happen. We need both.
30 African-American football players at the University of Missouri say they're on strike. It is the latest in a series of protests against the school's handling of race relations on campus.
Missouri graduate student Jonathan Butler was so outraged, he went on a hunger strike last week.
How do you feel? Empowered, ready to eat.
I am resigning as president of the University of Missouri today, and I take full responsibility for the inaction that has occurred.
People were shocked. And I think that was a seminal moment because it was so dramatic. And there's been a culture shift when it comes to athletes speaking out on social issues.
Every time I step outside, I see my die.
There is no such thing as the arc of history bending towards justice. People do that.
Is it okay to break the law or not? Because the cops are breaking the law left and right. Like, you don't own us anymore. You see, like, either we all have the same inalienable rights or we don't.
An independent investigation that Mr. Gray's death was a homicide has led us to believe that we have probable cause to file criminal charges.
Every time I step outside, I see my die.
That's why I'm here. That's why the uprising began. That's why we're still rising to this day.
Today, the Department of Justice is filing a lawsuit in federal district court against the city of Ferguson, Missouri, alleging a pattern and practice of law enforcement conduct that violates the First, the Fourth, and the 14th Amendments of the Constitution and federal civil rights laws.
I'm really proud of this generation. It's a revolution in a way. They have used this new tool, and I think Black Lives Matter will define this shift in America. I think we will look at Black Lives Matter like we looked at the civil rights movement.
The Black Lives Matter movement is the most important development in Black life in the last 40 years. And the most important aspect of it is that it's ordinary people fighting this fight. It is something that we have been responsible for getting out onto the streets. And I think the movement is here to stay.